in lockdown and as we come out of lockdown and perhaps go into another lockdown. And also, I have to mention that we face other challenges in society too. Black Lives Matter has made us reflect on racism in museums and in society and what that means and how we combat it. And we know that climate change and the climate crisis is ongoing and needs to be addressed. So that's some of the context in which we work. It's now my great pleasure to welcome our first two speakers. The first speaker is David Anderson, who's the Director General of Amgueddfa Cymru, the National Museum in Wales, and also the author of a Commonwealth report from over 20 years ago. David, can I hand over to you for your thoughts on the work so far?
Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to put a little bit of sort of historical context to this, and I know that Dhikshana will then pick up about the present situation, really. And would like to go back to 1848, I beg your pardon, when the Chartists were marching on London. How did the museums of the time respond? The British Museum trustees armed their staff and barricaded the museum in the expectation that the Chartists might try and take over the building. And that sort of set a tone of relationship really between the radical movements and the museums, or at least gave you an indication of it. So when just a few years later the Great Exhibition opened and was visited by 6 million people, it offered a different kind of model and led to what is arguably still the greatest experiment in cultural and education ever attempted in the United Kingdom. Because not only was the South Kensington Museum opening in the evening and actively encouraging working people to visit as well, but it also was the centre for a nations-wide network of colleges of art and colleges of science as well. It was one integrated system. And we've forgotten just what a radical idea that was, that culture and learning were effectively the same thing. In 1919, the Adult Education Report included 50 pages on museums. And it included among its recommendations that local museums should be part of the local education system. Now, this did not lead to a closer integration of local museums and the school and education system. What it led to was a reaction from the museum sector that declared that it did not wish to be to have that relationship, and led in fact actually to a separation, a deliberate separation by many museums from their educational function. And I would argue that from 1920 to 2020, essentially we have been living through a lost century. A century in which elitism has really been very deeply embedded in the work of museums. And it's an elitism that shows a resilience that equality can only envy. The museum sector has been Janus-headed throughout all of this, partly about education, but actually also much more seriously about other forms of exclusion. And I would argue that even now there's been a lot of shouting about support for current campaigns on climate, Black Lives Matter, and in the thinking about or the talking about COVID recovery. How far has that actually been a reality? And I would question whether the deep thinking, the deep rethinking has really begun yet. When I wrote the Commonwealth report, I was head of education at the V&A, and I was determined that I would do a research-based case for learning. The report was not what the Office of Arts and Libraries had commissioned. They'd wanted something much shorter and not research-based. However, they got what they got. The then Conservative minister at the time, when he read the report, said that he was not going to publish it. And he said that there was too much in the report around diversity and too much about community. I've used the word diversity. That was not the word he used, as passed back to me by the senior civil servant. And the report was very, very nearly not published. And I have to say it was in part because of the Museums Association's active behind the scenes lobbying that eventually it did see the light of day. However, I had hoped this would lead to a significant change of policy, particularly among the larger museums like the V&A where I was working. And within a few years, my naivety was exposed, really. I thought that a research-based case would lead to change. I underestimated how deep the cultural barriers were to that. And when the concept of intrinsic and instrumental value was introduced by John Holden and others, a distinction I regard as completely fraudulent anyway, without a research basis, one leading National Museum director turned to me and smiled and said, "David, that's the end of your education agenda." So in 2005, I started looking at other rationales and came upon the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the fact that there was a cultural strand to that was actually a central pillar of the original 1948 declaration, and made the case then for museums adopting cultural rights and cultural democracy as the foundation for their work. That hasn't had huge leverage either, I would say, to date, although I still have great hopes of that as a rationale for our work. And in 2010, when I went to Wales to be Director General of the National Museum Amgueddfa Cymru, I found a very strong tradition of communitarianism and participation, which I also think is essential if we are to move forward in learning in museums. And published an article shortly after that to try to bring these things together called Creativity, Learning and Cultural Democracy. So I would say that there is a long, long history of education in various forms in museums, but also we've never yet managed to establish the public and the research and the thinking behind the public role in museums absolutely at the centre of stage. And I think this is where this manifesto, I hope, will come in.
Thank you, David, and thank you for that historical context. It's really important for us, actually, and those of us that are working in and with museums, to remember some of the history of where we've come from as institutions, as a workforce, and to remember some of the incredible work that has been done before we got to this point. I was reading recently, as David has referred to, about some of the work that was done during the Second World War, where there was a real flourishing of thinking about the role of museums, because many museums were closed, as they are now. Many museums had taken their collections out of the buildings for safekeeping in the countryside, and so people who worked in and with museums at that time were really thinking about, well, what is the purpose of a museum in society? And that led to, you know, some of the changes and developments we saw in the post-war period. It's now a great pleasure to introduce Dhikshana Pering, who's the Head of Skills and Engagement at Somerset House, who's also going to add to our conversation about how we've got to this point in the research and where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon and David, for that, to the journey to now, I guess. And I will try and talk about the journey ahead. Like David, I don't have a crystal ball. So 20 years ago, I don't think he would have imagined we'd be thinking about learning and engagement in a world with pandemics and racism movements that could really change how we work as a sector. But I will try my best to think how we can use this manifesto to move forward. There is no doubt that the future holds worry for all of us, personally and professionally. If you're leading a team, then I know you will care and worry for the staff and the places that we are in right now at the end of the furlough scheme and other things around that as well. But also I know that selfishly, sometimes we worry about ourselves, what's going to happen to us in our roles. And we cannot forget that as we move forward. We also, in our area of work, worry about the people, our communities that come and engage with us. And that's very particular to people that work in learning and engagement. We think about our communities, those audiences, those people that come in all the time. That's what we base our work around. And 2020 has shown us that our in real life engagement could not work. And when we could reopen, if we could reopen, that what we had planned didn't work in a new world. We were trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. Digital became our focus, but even then we had spent years planning digital, thinking we had it right, and it didn't quite work either. It added an additional barrier because digital access is not equal for everyone. And we knew that we could not have the same connection with people not in person. We couldn't make that connection to our collections or our content. It added safeguarding issues for us as well. It changed everything that we were doing while we were still dealing with living through a pandemic. It's nice to feel familiar. It's nice to have a pattern of success. But what 2020, coronavirus and Black Lives Matter has shown us is that we can be pushed to change, that we can respond quickly and we can respond fast, and we can be flexible. It's really pushed. Anyone that thought they were flexible before 2020 definitely has learned that they can be even more so. This Learning and Engagement Manifesto comes at a time that hopes to galvanise the work that we do, take our sector forward, take our teams forward, take our organisations forward. And it feels right for the world that we're in right now. But of course, to be creative, how to come out the other side, to lead those teams, to connect with our communities with positivity is hard. But this manifesto and the excellent case studies that will sit around it will give you some hope. They will help you adapt. They will show that the importance of learning and engagement and how we advocate that to our leaders and to our communities and society. The challenges of 2020 are not going away, but what is going to happen in the coming years is still not known. I still don't have that crystal ball. But what I do know is that this manifesto wasn't written to work within a pandemic or with the Black Lives Matters movement, but what it's showing is more relevant than ever, that it would work through the issues of the pandemic, that it will support us to think about anti-racist movements when statues are toppled, when collections are questioned, when content is questioned, and our very institutions are questioned, and we can actively start to make changes. It works in this context, so it will definitely work in the years to come. So my thoughts around it is that in launching this manifesto, it's an exciting new decade. The first year of this decade has not quite gone to anyone's plan, but we have many years ahead to take this manifesto and to implement it and see its successes, and also professionally see ourselves move forward as well. There is no blueprint, so we really have a chance to try something new. When we talk about the past now, it's not years ago. The past is just 2019. It's completely different. And this manifesto will show us how to move forward into the new decade. It may seem daunting, and I definitely feel daunted myself, but I know that by looking at this manifesto, it can guide me, it can support me, and it can help me advocate for my team, for myself, for the organisations I work in and the sector. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Sharon.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers, and I'd like to say a personal note of thanks to David and Dhikshana for all the work that you've put into this research and the manifesto so far, on top of what I know to be very, very busy day jobs. You've just put an enormous amount of heart and thinking into the research, and there's a real opportunity now for us to, I think, working with GEM and Engage and with everybody who's on this webinar, to really take the commitment and the work forward. We sort of thought, you know, we were coming to the end of the lockdown when it eased and when some of our museums and institutions began to reopen, but we know we've got another 6 months, which is daunting, and we know the harsh realities of that for individuals and for institutions and for our communities. But we should also use it as a time to reflect and to really think about what that means for a museum in society, and I think both David and Dhikshana have summed that up well. So we're now going to go to the points in the manifesto. It is still draft. We are still working on it. As I said, the point is we're working towards our conference launch date, but everybody who's here is going to get a sneak peek preview at the manifesto points. And we've asked a series of speakers to talk about how they would work to those manifesto points in their institutions. I think it always helps, and especially if you work in learning and engagement, to see the practical application. What does this look like for my communities, for my work, and in my institution? So I'm just going to go now to the first manifesto point, which is on cultural rights and cultural democracy. And that says, access to and participation in culture is a basic human right. Everyone has a right to representation and reflection in museums, and communities should have the power to decide how they engage. And I'm going to ask Grace Todd, who is the Strategy Coordinator and Senior Learning Participation and Interpretation Officer at Amgueddfa Cymru, to now speak to that point. Over to you, Grace.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's okay. It's been a tough week. So yeah, as Sharon said, I'm a senior learning participation and interpretation officer, but currently I'm seconded to develop a new year 10-year strategy for the organisation, of which I'll mention more in a bit. So at Amgueddfa Cymru, we've adopted a rights-based approach to our work, challenging inequality and championing social justice. This work focuses on 3 strategic areas: participation, representation, and agency. An important example of this work is the exhibition Who Decides? Making Connections with Contemporary Art, a large-scale art exhibition at National Museum Cardiff that ran from September 2017 through to October 2018. It was created with clients from the Woolwich, who are a Welsh charity that support adults with experience of homelessness. Now, over a period of months, a group of 10 Woolwich curators worked with colleagues from across the museum to make the exhibition. The project built on an established partnership that we developed with the Woolwich through the Our Museum project as part of the St Fagans redevelopment project, something that was acknowledged when St Fagans won the Art Fund Museum of the Year prize. Over 6 months, the group worked with myself and Nick Thornton, who is the head of fine art at the museum, to curate and develop the exhibition. The exhibition was developed through a series of participatory workshops. Through these workshops, the volunteers became involved in all aspects of the exhibition and were empowered to take the lead in selecting objects, producing the interpretation, developing the exhibition's graphic and 3-dimensional design, choosing the exhibition title, installing the show, and finally, developing and delivering the public programme. This meant that they worked with colleagues from across most departments within the organisation. So the process embedded participatory practice across the organisation, but also developed the skills of colleagues that were maybe a little bit less familiar with engagement work. These workshops built the confidence of the volunteer curators, but also developed us as staff and as an organisation. We listened and we worked together to develop a shared vision. The lived experience of the Woolwich curators, many of whom had never been to an art gallery or a museum before, brought new knowledge and skills to us that challenged and changed the way that we see and understand our work and contemporary art as well. From the outset, the project aspired to be an honest and open partnership of equals, questioning established values and structures. This process delivered an accessible and welcoming exhibition, visited by over 60,000 people. It received many positive reviews, and colleagues came from a variety of galleries all across the UK. I think I might have met some of you during that process, to talk about the methodology used to develop the exhibition. I'll put a link to a short film that will give you an idea of what the exhibition looked like in the chat when we finished. But one thing that really surprised people when they came in was that it looked like a normal exhibition. Now, the curators didn't want to make an exhibition about homelessness, and why should they? They wanted to make a high quality, accessible art exhibition that was welcoming to everyone, no matter their background and experience. They weren't up for campaigning or drum beating. They wanted to take people's hearts and minds with them gently, subtly. One example of this was a design feature where they created a comfortable, relaxed reading and seating area designed to give visitors permission to sit, talk to one another, spend time in the space. They saw the gallery as a community asset and they wanted people to use it on their terms. The object labels that they wrote were honest and vital. They reinforced the difference from traditionally curated art exhibitions, where interpretation often seems to be produced for a peer review readership from a position of powerful authority. Following the exhibition, the curators completed an accredited course. It was an introduction to Welsh art, using the skills and knowledge that they developed in curating the exhibition. Now, gaining a qualification was something that they'd all said from the offset they wanted to gain from the process. Many took on wider volunteering roles at the museum. Their involvement signalled new ways of working and ways in which museums can become civic active spaces within our communities. We're moving to a museum model that places social justice at the heart of its operations and co-produces relevant and engaging experiences with communities from across Wales. Now, to close, I'd like to quickly share with you another example of cultural democracy in practice that we're working on right now. We're in the midst of a large-scale consultation to help us develop a new 10-year strategy for Amgueddfa Cymru. Now, everyone in Wales has a fundamental human right to participate in the cultural life of the nation. We as a museum aim to be present and accessible, both physically and digitally. Through the public consultation, we're asking people to work with us to develop this vision. We'd planned to visit communities and events across Wales to talk to people face-to-face this summer, but COVID has forced us to change. We've developed a digital programme that includes easy read resources, audio content and interactives developed for families and children to share their views creatively. Now, as mentioned earlier, we know that digital poverty is a barrier. So we worked with partners in housing associations, food banks and other support organisations to distribute paper versions of these creative activities to families, along with art materials and ideas for things to do at home inspired by our museums. Time's nearly up, so I'm just going to finish really, really quickly by saying that I'm also going to put a link to the consultation into the chat. Some of you have already contributed. Thank you so much. You've got a week left to do so. So please, if you've got the time, have a go at looking at the consultation and completing the survey for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Grace. There's been a lot in the chat already about from people who've seen Who Decides, saying what an amazing exhibition it was, and it was an absolutely fantastic example of co-curation and putting, as you said, social justice at the heart of the museum. And if you could share those links in chat, that would be fantastic, because the last point on chat is, are there any links or information online about Who Decides? So I'm sure Grace will put that up there. And it's a great segue into the next point of the manifesto, which is about social justice. And under that manifesto point, it says museums have a responsibility to work with their communities to overcome the challenges of poverty and exclusion to achieve equality of outcomes. It's a really nice, simple point. I'm going to hand over to Claire Benjamin, who is the Head of Learning and Participation at National Museums Liverpool. Claire, if you could unmute yourself and talk to this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Can everyone hear me? Unmuted. Great stuff.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Nice sunny day in Liverpool, and I know there's some friendly faces with me today from Liverpool as well as around the country. My colleagues are here, and I think I just saw Lindsay at Tate as well. So, social justice. I had prepared some notes, and then there was a couple of things that stopped me really. It levelled me this week. The first thing was, I was about to have a call with one of our colleagues who works for Asylum Link in Liverpool, and he couldn't make the call because actually he was having to help some of his colleagues because there was no other sense of term, vigilantes on the street making sure asylum seekers were behaving themselves, and they were his friends and colleagues. So he couldn't make the call to talk about a museum project because he was supporting people overcome challenges around inequality. And then the other conversation I had, which actually also was food for thought for this point, was I was going to talk about Black Lives Matter and NML's response, and I still will, but I was talking to colleagues in Liverpool who reminded me, let's be careful to not go from invisibility to hyper visibility, which is potentially a risk of what's happening at the moment. Organisations are obviously quickly responding, and quite rightly so, but we have to sustain and embed everything that we're talking about. And I didn't want to just come in and start case studying, and I think it's just important because, you know, we're all learning colleagues, we're all educators, and we have to be so mindful in our own practice. But in terms of social justice, yes, NML has done an awful lot over decades, but actually, you know, we don't always get everything right, and more so than ever, we're really listening, which is critical. I did find another nice quote actually in terms of defining social inclusion. This was the process of improving the terms on which individuals and groups take part in society, and actually we can really help make those terms accessible and inclusive, and it has to be an equal partnership. We can't make assumptions that everybody wants to engage with museum learning programs. Actually, what's been really coming to the fore during this pandemic and in response to Black Lives Matter is actually people really do want to come together, have that sense of belonging. People have been really at risk of becoming more isolated, but actually some of those movements have really brought people together, socially distanced, but coming together. What we've been doing at NML, we've been really visible about our response to Black Lives Matter in terms of visible statements, digitally, statements in the venues. We've kind of ripped up a lot of our terms of reference around how we do learning and engagement, from very practical ways of changing who chairs some of the groups that we run with community organisations. We have a respect group that traditionally was always very much NML chaired and NML led, and actually we're having that co-chair and looking at how we can operate in terms of task forces, real collaborative working. We've done that on a practical way through our work this year with the Slavery Remembrance Day programme. My colleague is on the call, and to be fair, he did all of the work, it wasn't me. But in terms of how we approached that, we really thought about how we worked with our community partners. We ran a series of community conversations in January, which seems a lifetime ago. It was all in person, it was in community venues, and it was wonderful because we were interacting in person. But that made us have to have that step change to shift tack and look at how we engage digitally. We did have concerns around digital poverty, and actually, are we going to be again risking people not engaging in our learning programme around Slavery Remembrance Day? Actually, the reality was, and particularly in Liverpool, you know, we're in a local lockdown now. People of Black or minority ethnic heritage were at an increased risk in engaging physically in our programming, and actually doing that shift online was safer. Plus, we engaged with a lot broader communities and numbers in terms of who accessed the programme, and we had some wonderful feedback. I just wanted to share a quote with one of the participants who took part in some of the activity, and they talked about how learning and hearing, so that I can make sure that I am doing everything in my power to support and help those still in the shadow of discrimination and racism. Now, if through museum learning and engagement we've been able to either trigger or collaborate in somebody having that response and feeling moved, and they want to do something to support people feel involved, and to tackle some of the big global issues we're dealing with, well, that's fantastic. And it wasn't just a museum event, it was a wonderful collaboration. And I think it's just, hopefully that was an example to just talk through how we've been approaching working through and being a social justice led museum organisation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Claire, and really good to start with that salutary reminder of the real world that's out there and what's happening in our communities, and how we have a responsibility and a duty, I think, to face up to that. It's not always about thinking what we want to do and what we think is right. It's often listening to what's happening in our communities, and I know there's some really difficult, challenging conversations that we need to have. It's now my great pleasure to talk about the next point on the agenda, which is around activism. People who know me know that this is a subject that's really close to my heart. I've written and talked about activism in the museum sphere for a number of years now. Under this point, it says museums are not neutral. Museum activism should be based on listening, acting, and delivering with our communities, which I think Claire also alluded to. So it's my pleasure to introduce Matt and Jess Turtle from the Museum of Homelessness. Over to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here today, and we've enjoyed hearing from everyone so far. We've already learned a good deal of stuff. So we wanted to talk about Museum of Homelessness and our activism work. Museum of Homelessness started out in 2015 wanting to tell stories. But the museum actually took its first steps in a climate of increasing homelessness, increasing deaths of homeless people, austerity, poverty, hostility to migrants. All of those things impact on the lives of our community every day. So it quickly became clear to all of us involved in the museum that telling stories isn't enough. for this moment in time, for this moment in history, and for our community. So the Museum of Homelessness developed a sort of sharper campaigning and direct practical focus as well. So when COVID-19 hit, it's no surprise that our response to the pandemic was governed by those two things.
Yeah, the pandemic represents a particular risk for the homeless and vulnerably housed community. I remember back in March, the streets were beginning to empty, museums are having to close their doors, and all the things that people access on the streets and elsewhere, you know, things like day centres, food handouts, food banks, were all closing en masse. So it represented a real dangerous and dire situation. And whilst this was happening, there was a lot of confusion from the authorities about what we should all be doing. So it was time to create our own guidance in order to save lives.
So the museum's core group and trustees came together and decided to repurpose all of our activity and resource to campaigning and direct practice.
Oh, I think Matt and Jess have frozen slightly. I don't know if other people are getting that. Yeah, okay. We could give them a second to come through. I know that where they live, they have some problems with internet sometimes, and I think they've dropped out. So I'm going to move on to the next point. We will come back to them because it is a brilliant example for us to use of museum activism. So the person that's speaking next, if you could prepare while I read out the point about community participation. And that is, museums should develop innovative models of engagement which represent the cultural context of their communities and nations, and that are brave and challenging. Community groups should be valued and fully engaged with all functions of the museum. And it's my great pleasure to hand over to John Slay, who is a freelance consultant working with many museums across the UK. Over to you, John.
Hello, everyone. Community participation, when you read the statement on the screen, one of the key things that leaps out is the word challenge and the word bravery. It's something that I've tried to embrace, excuse me, I've tried to embrace in my practice, and it's also changed my life. One example of that came for me in 2018 when I was working with Birmingham Museums Trust and with the Arts Council Collection. Faced with a number of accessibility obstacles, I constantly have to ask the question, am I as brave as the collections that I'm representing? Am I as brave as the stories that are being put forward in those conversations within the collections? And oftentimes it's so beyond the lived experience, not only of myself, but also the teams I'm operating in. The question is, how do we do it with integrity and with purpose? In the exhibition Women, Power and Protest, I was faced with one of those huge barriers with a piece of art in the collection that talked about violence against women. It was an actual gun that had been decommissioned and reused as an art piece. It spoke about violence against women. It spoke about general carrying issues in society in terms of weaponry. So incendiary as a conversation to have within a museum setting, but also how do I do that? How do I have that conversation with integrity? How do I use this piece for a function rather than something to be not necessarily talked about or maybe avoided within the collection? The answer to me came to reach out to community participation and community partners to facilitate social workers using that piece as a tool for advocacy in changing the lives of other people. So with this particular piece of art in this exhibition, I reached out to an amazing group called the Precious Trust. Over a 4 or 5 month period, I worked with them, just laying out the foundations of trust in terms of what I wanted to achieve and what this piece of art could do. The Precious Trust works specifically with young girls that are at risk of violence and sex trafficking within the Birmingham area. It's run by an amazing person called Dr. Marcia Shakespeare, MBE. You may know her because in the media she was noted that in the millennium, her daughter tragically was gunned down in gun violence in Birmingham. Since that moment, she became an activist within the community and created the Precious Trust specifically to change and alter the courses of vulnerable girls' lives within Birmingham. Working with Dr. Marcia Shakespeare, I was able to build trust and to orientate this piece of art as not just something decorative or a conversation that other people are having about their lived experience, but orientate it as an active tool that they could use. Working with Marcia, we brought in a series of girls that were in very vulnerable states within Birmingham to use that piece of art as a conversation anchor within the gallery. Imagine with me the emotion in that space as a community activist talked about the loss of her daughter, using the art piece as a tool of advocacy at a point of crisis in these girls' lives. Working with the girls, I was able to reinterpret the entire collection, from the labels to the associated material that was used within it. And we could broadcast that message to thousands of people that ended up using that exhibition. Taking it further, community participation for me on this point, we talked about not only just in terms of how we can affect the locale in terms of the participants in our local region, but how we can take community participation from regional to national. So working with the MP Jess Phillips, we were very fortunate that we were able to take members of the group to London, and they were able to feed back directly to Jess Phillips in the Houses of Parliament on the current bill that she was working on in terms of domestic violence towards women. The stories that started in the gallery based on a lack of lived experience and the challenge and the bravery needed to face it in this conversation turned into young women going to London to speak to an MP to feed into a national bill to hopefully change lives. Small moments within this were the key, excuse me, got a frog in my throat. Small moments within this engagement period were the telling ones that community participation was the lead. For example, one of the girls that went with us to London, 7 members of her family clubbed together to buy her new shoes so that she could feel confident and she could feel special while she was in the Houses of Parliament. Jess Phillips herself gave us a private tour around the Houses of Parliament in favour of all the other visitors that were in that space. Community participation started with that cup of tea and with that leap of faith in terms of acknowledging that this challenge and the bravery needed was beyond the lived experience within the team, and that I needed to upskill. And rather than me fence these conversations, I could facilitate social workers that could use these to change lives. The points raised in this manifesto and how it's applied are not dry, static targets in funding, for example, or that we're working towards. They have the power to affect and change lives on not only a regional level, but on a national level as well. I very much believe in this point, and I believe in what's happening today. I'll drop the links to the case study into the chat, and if you've got any questions, just like all the other participants, please do let me know. Sending lots of love to everyone.
Thank you, John. That was fantastic. Really, I saw that exhibition as well. Absolutely powerful, moving, really resonated, and also lucky enough to have a tour with you around the exhibition to understand some of the stories behind it. I'm hoping now that I can hand back to Matt and Jess. I can't see them, but that doesn't mean to say they're not here.
We're here.
Can you, hi Matt and Jess. Can you pick up the story where you left off, please?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. So we've switched our video off in case, so it doesn't put so much pressure on our Wi-Fi. I think I was just sharing that we published a plan to utilise empty hotel accommodation for people who are rough sleeping. And we published that because we're a small organisation. We're able to act quite quickly, talk to people, publish that, and that was subsequently adopted as national policy. And 15,500 people were brought into safety during lockdown. So it's something that we're proud to have played a part in.
Yeah, during that whole period, our work kind of brought us into contact with homelessness health teams in London, government rough sleeping, the Government Rough Sleepers Initiative, local partners and grassroots groups. And it's in this kind of climate that we formed the COVID-19 Homeless Task Force, working with groups like the Outside Project, the Simon Community, Union Chapel, Greenpeace, and 2 local mutual aid groups, and the list goes on. Many others, as part of something completely new for us.
So we, having begun the campaigning, we then borrowed an empty community centre from Islington Council, and with those partners, particularly Streets Kitchen, we set up a 7-day-a-week emergency food and supplies aid operation, really, getting food and whatever was needed out to people who were left on the streets. Still, some people were left out, but also people who had been newly placed in the emergency accommodation. So that was the Homeless Task Force Hub, which was quite an interesting thing to be a part of. And we even repurposed our museum shelving to store the dried goods and cans. So we had repurposed almost fully for that period.
And all that happened in just 3 weeks.
So as the summer progressed, we had a task force of 50 volunteers. They were helping out over 3 months as we dispatched 9,000 meals and care packs to people that we were supporting. But the direct frontline work was complemented by continued lobbying as well, because the problems that we face and that our community face are far from over. So one of the things we did over the summer was got organised with the migrants' rights sector and got involved with supporting the migrants' rights sector and coordinating on asking the government to waive the no recourse to public funds rules. Now, unlike the hotel campaign, that campaign has been unsuccessful. And tragically, we recently in Glasgow had the death of Mercy Baguma, who died with her starving baby next to her in Home Office accommodation. If those rules were lifted, Mercy would still be with us, and may she rest in peace. And we will continue focusing our campaigning on supporting homeless migrants, as well as people who are British nationals and who are homeless. So for us, activism and learning are not separate. All of the task force work involved learning and engagement all the way through.
And as lockdown eased a bit in July, and the council asked for their borrowed community centre back, we've been reflecting and looking at what we can do next, because as Jess says, the pandemic has not ended, and as the second wave looms, we've had to continue our activism and the work of the task force, and we've actually been searching for our own building. So you can find us on the streets of Highbury Corner every week between 12 and 2 as we try and get our messages out there.
So we're so pleased that activism is within this manifesto. We think it's so important because, you know, learning, engagement and activism are actually one and the same when we're trying to make change in society. They're not separate. We hope the Museum of Homelessness is bringing something new to a field that is saturated with sensationalist journalism and very binary ways of looking at the world. Fundraising messages from charities which actually increase dehumanised perception of homeless people. That's a whole other talk, so I won't go into that. But as an organisation, our organisation and everyone involved in it, we've become very angry about the injustices that our community has been subject to, particularly in the last decade. But we know it's not enough to be angry. You must also have knowledge. And to win in campaigning, actually, you must have more and better knowledge than your opponent. So that's why we think, in terms of learning, museums as specialist knowledge institutions are really well placed, actually, to make arguments for and with communities on matters of social justice. And in Museum of Homelessness community, you know, we're actually in the process of educating ourselves and others every day. And we do that because at the moment, at this time in history, we have to.
It worked.
Thank you so much for that, Matt and Jess. I'm really glad we got you back. A really inspiring example, as they all have been so far. I know it was a real honour for me personally to do some of that volunteering in the early days of the lockdown and the pandemic, and just to have that contact with other volunteers and also with the people that we were meeting and talking to is just transformational, actually. And I wish every museum professional and people who work in and with museums could experience that absolutely inspirational work. So I need to, thank you. I need to move on to the next manifesto point. Let me share that now. And that is on collections. And that manifesto point says collections belong to communities, and without communities, museums are just storage warehouses. Collections are for public use. So it's my pleasure to introduce Laura van Broekhoven, the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum, to speak to this point. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Sharon, and thank you for the wonderful learnings that I've already had today from just listening to everyone. And it's really quite emotional, I think, to see how much work is being done in museums. And it's wonderful that the Museum Association is really leading that work. Now, for the Pitt Rivers Museum, and I've taken a picture of some of the work that we've been doing, and I think that's been quite publicly available. I'll put a link in the chat where we sort of have been looking through what can these collections mean today, and especially how are they relevant today to so many different people. And Nina Simon, obviously in her Art of Relevance, argues that a museum matters to when it matters to people. And I suppose that as a museum located in Oxford in the UK, we might think as long as we get enough visitors through the door and we find ourselves being relatively interesting to those visitors, we are relevant. However, given the nature of the collections that we steward and the way those collections were brought together as part of a colonial process where people went out gathering objects, they felt entitled to do so during the time of British Empire, and systems and structures that were used for exploitation of resources and people were set up during that time of empire, extracting resources, extracting wealth, bringing that to the center, and that sort of way of these collections ending up in our museums was very much part of that. It was a system of disempowerment of local authority, and people who took these objects felt entitled to do so, to appropriate them in order to represent cultural practices and to speak about them, use them for their learning and their research, and for others from a Eurocentric perspective. And so this process of taking and categorizing cultural practices was often very problematic, as there was no acknowledgement of the views of originating communities and no reflection on the methods used to dispossess communities of these objects. And so the undoing of this coloniality is an integral part of the work the museum does today. And at the heart of what we do as a museum lies caring for people as much as caring for things that they make, the things that they make, and the philosophies that lie behind them. And so we know that there are a great many things to consider while we learn how to best care for objects and for each other as people who care for these things. But the collections that the Pitt Rivers Museum cares for, when we are starting to sort of look at what would co-curating mean on all levels, so co-curating the learning programs, co-curating the programs of thinking through how do we use words in the databases, how do we actually label things, how do we make exhibitions. So we've started to work very closely with communities, both communities locally and people living in diaspora locally as communities from much further away. And working with those communities really challenges the way that we work on all levels. And I suppose there are times that I really think, is this even possible within a museum like ours to do that sort of work? Because there are moments where one really deeply doubts whether museums are able, given their histories, are able to be decolonized. But I think some of the sort of important ground rules for us have been that it's a process, not a product that we're working towards. That underlying that process are values of parity and equity, where we try to truly build relationships of trust and respect. Listening and learning needs to be part of that process, and a readiness to change and adapt. So one's ways of working, thinking, being personally, as well as institutionally. And so there are elements of secrecy, cultural sensitivities, but also issues that have to do with the sort of what Robin DiAngelo writes about in her White Fragility, where, now, for example, when we've taken off display a number of objects because other communities find it really objectionable that those would be on display, such as the Tsansa and the shrunken heads. I get emails from people who feel entitled to continue to see these objects in our displays because they feel that they've been learning from them and that we would be hiding history when we are actually not putting certain things on displays. So it's about sort of looking at where is the balance of who decides, who is the person who we're going to be listening to, and whose fragility are we going to continue to consider. And I think that was for us as a museum also very much a process of learning, for all of our staff to be involved in those conversations, doing certain readings, doing certain thinking and self-reflection was very important in that. It does require a huge amount of flexibility in institutions that are usually risk averse and geared towards inflexibility and preservation. But due to the sort of, and you need to sort of set up a process that can be iterative, open-ended, that you don't know exactly what the outcome is going to be. And that makes it quite difficult because it also means that it's much co-curating this way is often much more expensive. There's not a lot of institutions that are ready to give funding to these sorts of projects, or that we can say, we don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, but we still do need the money to do the project. And I think that is one of the big problems for, especially around collections research and learning programs, actually, to sort of say, you know, to institutions, this is necessary work, but given that we don't know exactly what the people that are coming are going to tell us, we can't tell you all the outcomes yet. And so other things are that when we work with partners that are not conventional partners, so not artists, not researchers, not communities locally, where the same sort of frames of reference do not count, it is sometimes quite challenging. So for example, in some of the work that we did with the, and I don't know yet what's going to happen as next stage, with the Maasai, for example, they looked at several objects. So they identified from the 180 objects, 5 objects that they feel from the spiritual leadership and the traditional leadership, they found in their knowledge systems that those objects actually belong to certain families. They expect us to go to certain families in the UK, identify those families. They will be identifying families in the Maasai territories, and they want those families to come together. Those are things that are very difficult to know whether those will be able to happen. And at the same time, this sort of process of co-curation, therefore, is also challenging us in what we accept as where the places of knowledge production around those collections are. So it's been a very we've learned hugely. We also do sort of realize that due to the sort of firm rootedness in Enlightenment thinking and in coloniality and superiority of epistemologies, of ways of knowing, that sometimes these projects can be very challenging for everyone involved, and mostly also for the Maasai themselves, who need to sort of do a lot of work locally for people who are trying to themselves also decide what are the ways that we can manage some of the ongoing damage that is happening in this territory. So I think there's a huge amount to share in ways of working that on the one hand involve local communities, in the other hand communities that are very far away. I think the COVID-19 has been a wonderful way of also showing that we can work through digital means in this sort of work. So that is a sort of challenge that we have now when people can't come to the museum. How do we still virtually connect? That's what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think, you know, the work that you're doing at the Pitt Rivers Museum is a real beacon of hope, and partly because it is the Pitt Rivers Museum. When I first started working in the museum sector, I'd never heard of the Pitt Rivers Museum. I found out about the history of it, but it was introduced to me as the museum of the museum. And people sort of warmly sort of refer to it in that way as sort of set in aspic itself. And, you know, the collections are displayed in that very traditional way with the original labels. And to see the work that you're doing on labels and with communities on interpretation and rethinking the role of the collection is absolutely inspirational. So thank you very much for sharing that example with us. And if you could put anything in the chat, I know there's some questions there about the projects and the work that you've been doing. So I'm going to move on to the next example, which is on research and evaluation. This is a really important point of the manifesto, because sometimes I think it's overlooked in this area of work. And in the manifesto it says museums should support people-centred research that responds to the challenges in society and leads to positive change. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Caroline Gorsden, the development worker for programming and curating at Glasgow Women's Library, to speak to this point.
Hi everyone, thanks Sharon and thanks Museum Association for hosting me alongside these other incredibly moving projects that I've been enjoying listening to. So yeah, I work at Glasgow Women's Library, GWL for short, which since its inception has positioned itself using the terminology of the manifesto as a centre for social justice and transformation. It's the only accredited museum in the UK dedicated to celebrating women's lives and histories and achievements. It's got an archive, a library and an innovative public programme. So as Sharon says, I'm the development worker. My title is actually for programming, curating, partnerships and participation, which is a bit of a mouthful, so I do shorten it. But I think it's really important to stress that all of these elements overlap in GW. With participation at the heart of how we work with artists and researchers and central to how we programme. So the project I'm going to talk about is ongoing at the moment. It's been kind of interrupted from its sort of public platform, but it will be coming, and it exemplifies this crossover. It's called Lesbian Lives: Unveiling Hidden Her Stories, and it was conceived with our support by an independent curator called Freya Monk-McGowan. And it's funded by Esme Fairburn to facilitate research and access to one of the most important aspects of our collection, which is the Lesbian Archive. So just to give a very brief history of that archive, in 1995, whilst we were still an entirely volunteer-run organisation, GWL became custodian of the London-based Lesbian Archive and Information Centre, which we call LAKE for short, when it was threatened with closure. So for LAKE, it was important that the collection remained within a community of peers so that future users would be able to draw strength from it without facing many of the barriers that other, arguably more specialist institutions present. So the senior managers, Sue John and Adele Patrick, who are still with us in charge, remember the moment that it arrived in a kind of horse truck from London, and the volunteers being kind of actually moved to tears when they were unpacking the materials. So I think there was a kind of redrawing of what a specialist is that's happened at the Women's Library, that starts from valuing the lived experiences of those represented and seeing collections as a tool for their empowerment. So 25 years on, this expansive and growing collection makes up a third of the GWL archive and is still the only lesbian archive in the UK, and it holds potential for real impact and change. The collection includes evidence of close-knit, inclusive and intersectional communities. So in amongst the huge variety of materials I could mention, there are pamphlets and how-to guides for newly identified lesbians and bi women with titles like Being Black and a Lesbian, or Being a Lesbian with Disabilities, and Being a Lesbian with Children. And these kind of evidence a heartwarming support network that's going on in that collection. So speaking of the materials, Freya, the project curator, is moved by their bravery as well, in a moment when homosexuality was at best taboo and in the case of men illegal. So she says, as a queer woman, I understand and have lived experience of coming out without the representation of my life in either heritage institutions or wider society. I know the damage that this can do to a person's understanding of their place in society, their self-esteem, and importantly, their health and well-being. In initiating the project, the intention was to further unleash the potential of the collection by caring for, interpreting, and importantly, digitizing the materials with support from a trainee archivist and through an artist commission that will be given a platform next year at Glasgow International Festival. So supporting artists to make work out of the archive is something that GWL specialises in. It's an effective part of our ongoing campaign to activate significant histories in the present moment. But more than this, founding members of GWL were artists themselves, as well as being like Freya Monk-McGowan, members of the disenfranchised groups that they represent. So this is equally true of Ingrid Pollard, who I'm proud to say is the commissioned artist on the project. And it's been really amazing to see Ingrid finding snippets of her own history among the materials in the archive. So over an impressive career, she's proved adept at bringing to light pertinent narratives around representation and difference. So I'm really excited to be part of her bringing these skills to a history we're also invested in that has received so little attention. So final, but hugely important part of the project is that it's enabled us to support a trainee archivist, Lauren Kelly, who is working towards a vocational qualification. And sadly, there are only a few of these available in the museum sector. So she receives funding from the Modern Apprenticeship Scheme. So Lauren's working on the digitization process, but also to design and host workshops with different communities. So I'd like to end with Lauren's own words on the project, because in many ways I think she articulates this better than I can. So Lauren says that it's both a blessing and a privilege to be able to work closely with the Lesbian Archive, to know that there are records of LGBTQ community, that we've existed and fought and survived and will continue to do so for as long as necessary. It's humbling. To be able to preserve and look after these objects that document the thoughts and feelings of lesbian, bi and queer women is an incredibly emotional experience for me that I still struggle to fully explain. I'll be focusing on improving accessibility to our collections, as well as helping deliver events that allow people to engage and explore the materials held within. I'm really excited about that. Making arts and culture more accessible, especially to those who feel underrepresented and intimidated by those spaces, is so important to me. It's also rare to see archives and heritage positions that don't require an expensive master's degree, only offered at a handful of universities across the country, something which is obviously not within the reach for the majority of us. GWL are working to change that by offering this alternative path into the field. And I'm thrilled to be part of the process, especially as it involves working with such a culturally significant collection. Yeah, so that's me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that really illustrates that point about the need for research and evaluation in our collections, in the work that we do with our communities, but also who does the research and who has access to the archives. And that's a really important point for us to explore. And I was reminded, because of your mention of the funding, that several of the museums and the projects that have been mentioned so far are funded through the Museums Association Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, and we are still open for applications. We do it in rounds throughout the year, so if you check out our website, look for the funding pages, it's the Esme Fairbairn Collections Fund, and we really want to fund this type of project and this type of ambition and the points on the manifesto. We want to fund values-based work, we want to fund work that connects collections to communities in different challenging ways, and we want to fund the work around research as well. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much for that example and case study, Caroline. I'm going to move on to the next manifesto point, which is around partnerships, something that I know is dear to everyone's heart. And it says partnerships should bring communities together and be based on the principle of equity. Museums should work with a diverse range of partners and think beyond traditional partners and audiences. And it's my pleasure to introduce Celine Elliott, the engagement lead at Cornwall Museums Partnership, to speak on this point. Over to you, Celine.
Thanks, Sharon, and thank you for having me here today. So as Sharon said, I work for Cornwall Museums Partnership, which is also known as CMP. We've already heard some great examples of partnership work today. Partnership's commonly understood to mean two or more parties working towards a common goal, but our experience here in the Southwest is a bit more nuanced than this broad definition. And I think it probably holds value for many individuals as well as organisations in the museum sector. So the rural nature of Cornwall means we have to be resourceful. We simply don't have many of the assets available to those working in more urban areas. So be it in the physical sense, such as buildings, or in infrastructure, such as public transport. So someone like me, who's originally from Manchester, I would have taken that for granted in the past. Similarly, in the city, I could have drawn on a vast field of diverse organisations and professionals with wide-ranging expertise in a plethora of subjects. And it isn't that there isn't knowledge available in rural areas, it's just that you have to sometimes rely on connections to uncover the asset holders. So relationship building is key to the success of this, and I think that's probably universal wherever you're working. I think traditionally this might have been called networking, but I understand that for many people this is a loaded term and a frankly unappealing prospect. And in fact, it doesn't adequately cover the quid pro quo nature of how fruitful and fulfilling a relationship or a partnership can be. So the question is, how do you know if a potential partnership is viable? So at CMP, we use our organisational values to sense check whether a partnership is likely to be successful. And Sharon's mentioned about being values-led, values-driven, and that's fundamental to the way we work. So we can apply this approach across disciplines, whether it's working with tech companies, design agencies, or grassroots charities. If our values align or are similar, we can feel confident that we can make progress together. So I should stress that our values are broad. We build on 4 pillars: inclusion, innovation, integrity, and appropriately, collaboration. We find that developing our relationships through these touchstones means we never stray too far from our core purpose, which is namely achieving positive social change through and with museums. So if potential partners have positive social impact or change at the heart of what they do, the chances are we're probably good to go. The peninsular nature of Cornwall, we're surrounded on 3 sides by water, means we don't have neighbouring regions to call on either. So we often look for kinship in places overcoming similar challenges and learn from them. A good example would be in how organisations in parts of rural Scotland, the Highlands and Islands, have consistently been brilliant partners for us here in Cornwall. A good example of this recently would be, I was supporting a grassroots group of Cornish people of colour who've been developing educational resources for schools and, I hope, museum use. And I was able to use a partnership I'd formed via Fun Palaces, which is a national campaign for cultural democracy, which we also support in another strategic partnership. And I connected them with the Anti-Racist Educator, which was formed by a group of Scottish people of colour who'd already gone on part of a similar journey to my local collaborators tackling so-called rural racism, and they had a wealth of resources to share. It's worth mentioning here that we don't need to be expert in everything. As you've heard today, people here are brilliant educators and engagement specialists, but through partnerships we can redouble our impact as facilitators and furthermore create those all-important platforms for the seldom heard. I spoke a little earlier about being resourceful when it comes to thinking about assets and partnership work. And one asset we have in abundance in Cornwall is museums. We've got lots of them. So we estimate at least 77, but some unofficial counts put it at over 100, mainly small and volunteer-run museums. And I should say here that they may be small, but they are mighty. So their teams are committed, enthusiastic, and have excellent local knowledge. And my point here is that the best partnership work starts with recognising what you have and what you can offer to others. So think about yourself personally, your team, your collections and your building, and what you can do or what you could be for others. And a quantifiable measure of success for me in respect of this and in terms of community engagement is when requests start coming in. So we all know about the legwork that you have to put in to build those relationships, but when you feel those communication channels are open, and a simple example would be yesterday I had a phone call from an organisation that supports children in care, who we've worked really closely with over 4 years across the museum partnership. And they just wanted to know did any of our partners have a large enough space, so a gallery, for a socially distant staff meeting to take place. And I really think we need to seek to normalise the museum being utilised by and for its communities, go beyond its collections, include them, but go beyond them. And we should be amongst the first that our communities turn to. So I'll finish by paraphrasing Lonnie Bunch, the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And he said museums shouldn't seek to be the centre of the community, but rather community centres. Partnership work is key to this. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Celine. And Simon will probably kill me for saying this because we haven't announced it yet, but we're really pleased, and this is sneak peek, that Lonnie Bunch is going to be doing a keynote at our conference in November, so check that out. Some really important points there, I thought, about partnership and how we centre that in the work of the museum. So I'm going to have to move on to the last point on the manifesto now, which is a subject that's close to all of our hearts, and that is workforce. And I think this is one of the manifesto points that underpins everything else, because we can't achieve any of the above unless we have a workforce. And by workforce, I mean everybody who works in and with museums, freelancers, volunteers, consultants, paid staff, 0 hours, those that are trustees, those that are in leadership, and those that are just beginning. We need a workforce that represents our communities, is respected and rewarded equally, and delivers and supports this manifesto. And it's my pleasure to introduce Laura Bennison and Susie Cavill, who are the Outreach and Access Manager and trainee at Edinburgh Museum Service. Over to you.
Thank you, Sharon. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I was going to say it's good to see everyone, but it's better that we can't see everyone because that would be very daunting. But we are, Susie, just a bit of context. Susie and I are here to talk about what's been happening at Edinburgh Museums and Galleries. So at Edinburgh Museums and Galleries, we're in the second stage of a 3-year programme partnering with a social enterprise organisation who are called Next Step Initiative. And we've been partnering on something called the Inclusive Museums Heritage Project. And this is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And this programme aims to create opportunities for people of minority ethnic heritage to access the Scottish museum sector. So for us as a museum service, it's very important to be part of a positive action traineeship that actively addresses racism and the discrimination in our sector. This programme is sort of twofold. It seeks to act as a professional development opportunity for the trainees themselves, like Susie, but also as an organisational development opportunity. However, at Edinburgh Museums and Galleries, I think it would be fair to say that we are increasingly seeing the shortfalls of this approach, and that it just doesn't go far enough. And as a sector, we have a responsibility not to be providing entry routes that don't lead anywhere, that go to a dead end. And the onus is on us, and it's a great opportunity to be thinking in a more mature way about this, I think, and a more ambitious way. An example of this, just a very practical thing, is that our trainees have been asking us why they can't see the previous trainees from the previous year in our museums, aside from the fact they haven't actually been in our museums because of COVID, but why the trainees that are coming on board now are asking why can't they see previous trainees on our team in positions in our staff. And that's the crux of it, really, I think. So we need to commit financially to providing long-term mechanisms that support Black and minority ethnic individuals into our workplaces. What needs to change to retain our trainees? Let's look at this very practically. What can we provide, and what do we need in order to provide the opportunities that bridge the gap between traineeships and long-term paid employment based on individual skill sets? Do we need to be offering very different kinds of roles in our organisations as well? We definitely need to interrogate every aspect of our recruitment process. Museum qualifications, such as MAs, are an immediate barrier because of the cost involved. It seems kind of obvious to say, but worth saying that the issue of pay is fundamental. we can't expect individuals to want to work in our sector if they are not remunerated fairly for their work at the same rate as existing teammates. Let's look at what we are asking of them, how we are valuing their work, and we can't begin to work together on an equal footing within these existing power dynamics. Then with our current COVID heads on, we need to address what COVID means for our current trainees and the trainees that are coming after these trainees. I think, unfortunately, we're realising that we need to be realistic about planning for this. We need to factor in access to digital equipment for trainees that are working remotely. We need to focus on how all of us can be accessing knowledge about our collections, but from a distance, and most crucially, supporting our colleagues and trainees' well-being in future lockdowns that may or are already coming. So overall, just before I hand over to Susie, at Edinburgh Museums and Galleries, we recognise the need for systemic, structural change in order to have a workforce that represents our communities. It's something we want. It's challenging, and it's going to take a lot of difficult conversations, but I don't think it's unrealistic. We don't think it's realistic. We need to commit to this process, and we need to come back and look at how far we've moved on with it after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years. We need to hold ourselves accountable as organisations and decide exactly how we're going to do this, but we can work it out together.
Thanks everyone for today. It's been amazing. It's fantastic to be at this talk and to be able to speak from the perspective of someone who's actually on a traineeship with NSI within the museum and gallery setting in Edinburgh. Something I feel that's deeply important and can be missed when we talk about the inclusion of BAME people in any workplace or training scheme is to remember that each and every one of us is an individual. Our passions are unique. Our career trajectory is also unique. We don't all want to be in museums to deal solely with decolonisation or BAME issues. You know, some of us love museums because we love dinosaurs and other cool stuff. And really that's the point for me, that we're often brought in to work on difficult and painful aspects. Our diversity is actually that we have different ideas, different goals and different skill sets. Coming from an arts and theatre background, I know more about Shakespeare than I do about the Bhagavad Gita. And, you know, actually that's a strength because my interpretation of Shakespeare adds to the diversity in a way that it wouldn't if we separate all these things out in categories. You know, BAME experiences, inclusion and projects and diversity over here and all the rest of the fun stuff over here. I'm lucky that the museum staff in the Edinburgh Museums and Galleries have let me explore. They've got to know me and they let me work on projects that, you know, make my heart bells ring. Projects I enjoy and I can give my passion, my expertise to. They don't see me as a token hire. They allow me to co-create my projects with them and they see me as an asset. Finally, before the buzzword was intersectional, many of us never mentioned our race, because we hoped the rest of you wouldn't notice. But now the cat's out of the bag, you know we're here, and you're expecting us to talk about it. And many of us still might not feel safe talking about it. We were told from a very young age, never talk about racism because it will set you back in your career. So I believe a holistic approach to supporting BAME people in the workplace is needed. You know, nothing over the top. We don't need lots of therapy, but you know, we might need to decompress, to decolonize ourselves a little and work out how to take ownership of some of the difficult experiences that many of us have had in workplace scenarios. You know, not to weaponize, but to strengthen us, because it's not about what makes us weak. It's about what makes us strong. And we do that, all of us together. Thank you.
Fabulous, thank you. And thank you for being so honest about your experience, because I think, you know, reflecting back what trustees and what trainees have said to you about where is the presence of the trainees that went before, it's a really interesting one for us all to reflect on. It's great to do these schemes and it's great to think about how they work, but if we're not providing the opportunities for people to then work in museums and galleries and to progress in their careers, then we're failing in our duty and responsibility to make our workforce more inclusive. And thank you, Susie, for reflecting so honestly on your experience of being a trainee, which I know is ongoing. I think it is a fantastic scheme, but it's always good for us to say this is good, but what can we do better, and how can we change our practice? So I think that was a really amazing set of speakers, and it's kind of blown my mind and blown my heart as well. It's really, really engaged me. It's been difficult to concentrate on what all of you have said, as well as following some really great chat in the chat function. Now we're going to move into workshops now. I'm hoping this transformation will happen seamlessly. You should be automatically sent to workshop rooms. I think we've got about 40 different breakout rooms. We've got about 20 minutes. The rooms will need to be self-facilitated, and we want you to think about two things. How can we adapt our offer to the challenges that we face in society now? And how can we use the manifesto in our museums? So that's how can we adapt our offer to the challenges we face in society, and how can we use the manifesto in our museums? Simon is going to press the button in a minute for us all to go there. If when you get in the breakout room, you could think about those questions, but also select a volunteer or somebody volunteer to capture the discussion and to put that in the chat when we come back into the main room. We need to also observe good rules about listening and hearing all voices and views. If you find you haven't been allocated to a room, or you're in a room where there aren't that many other people, come back into the main room and we'll reallocate. So Simon, if you can send people off now, we'll have about, I think, 20 minutes for discussion on those questions. The last 2 minutes discussing implementation. I will put our thoughts into the chat, and I would ask if you have had a facilitator, if you can put any pertinent points into the chat, and any feedback into the chat. Will capture some of it that way. We knew there were a lot of people signed up to this workshop, to this webinar, and we knew there'd be a lot of workshop breakout groups, so we can't really take all of the feedback. We'd have to kind of have a whole day at it, but there will be opportunities to carry on this conversation. One of the main ones being joining us at our conference, which is from the 2nd to the 6th of November. It's online. It was going to be in Edinburgh. There's nobody sorrier than me that we're not in Edinburgh for the first week in November, but it will be a fantastic online conversation. We've got big topics at that conference on Black Lives Matter, on decolonisation, on restitution and repatriation, on the future of museums, and on this learning and engagement manifesto. So there'll be an opportunity there to discuss again. We're going to get some international speakers to reflect on the manifesto and give us their thoughts on how relevant it is to their areas of practice. So there's a real opportunity to take the conversation forward. In the breakout room that I was in, when we did get our 2 minutes to talk about how we would implement the manifesto, there were some really good reflections on using it to elevate learning and engagement to the same level as other disciplines, which I thought was a really pertinent point, and to make sure that everyone in our community is reflected in the work of the museum. Again, a really pertinent point, and people saying that they're keen to take it back into their teams and their institutions to talk about how it might be used to further the work in those museums. So we're all back in the room now, I think, I hope. I hope you had brilliant, lively conversations. I can see things coming through on the chat, so we will capture and share all of those, and we are recording this, so we will share it after the event. think we'll have to do some editing of various bits of it where we went out into the breakout rooms. So we're now going to very quickly talk about feedback and next steps. I've said some of the things that we're going to do as a Museums Association. We are working in partnership with GEM and Engage on this and others. So we will carry the conversation on through conference. I wanted to bring back in Dhikshana and David to just add their concluding thoughts. So if I can hand over to David first, I think. Hang on, I might have got that the wrong way around. Yes, David first. Over to you.
I think it's been really inspiring and fills everyone, I think, with hope to hear the examples of work that have been done, most of it very recently and most of it in response to COVID or the various crises that we're experiencing just now. One observation is that I think organizations, however, are much more diverse than perhaps we are in this program. And I've observed a journey of different conflicting philosophies through COVID. And many organizations and many people in this group have been using the opportunity really of the crisis to accelerate change, to move more towards a community-based program of work. But at the same time, some other museums have used it to really go back into a very restrictive view of their role with the public. At Amgueddfa Cymru, we've established 8 task and finish groups with about 50 staff who have been given the role of doing a 360-degree look around our services as an organization. And the people on this group, I regard as being, the next generation of leaders really for the organization as well, and very much are accelerating the role of communities inside the museum and bringing them in as active agents even more than they were before, because we have been doing this work for some time, as Grace have said, but we're accelerating that very powerfully now. And we can see that the need is out there. The poverty and the inequality have hugely expanded during this time. However, the traditional building-focused model of museums is now really, I think, being questioned much more than it would have been before COVID struck. Many of our museums have found that we can actually do really strong, powerful work without the communities we work with necessarily being inside the galleries and inside our spaces. And to deny this, in a sense, is to keep oneself on a kind of Galapagos island of evolution of social policy, when actually there is this great opportunity to reframe and rewrite the social relationship of museums to society. So as a museum director, I need museum staff who will help the organization to rethink itself. And that can be educators, but it can be curators, it can be visitor experience staff, it can be conservators. In fact, really what we need going forward are museum workers with multiple experiences and multiple skills, if we're able to face and address the challenge that we have. And one other observation that I've got is that museums perhaps are a way of thinking. We happen to have applied them almost exclusively as a way of thinking within buildings historically. But actually it's a way of thinking that in principle can be done anywhere as well. And as a director, I need people who are community-centered. I need people who are thinkers about the organization as a community center, and a community center that can be anywhere, and have the confidence to make a very clear case inside the organization for this, in the face of opposition. And I know through my own career that opposition can be very strong and it can be undermining, and it can be debilitating as well. So it's not easy always in organizations to do this. But for those directors anyway who want to see the organization move forward and address these challenges, we need those people who have the confidence to stand and claim the center ground, not stay on the periphery or not be forced to stay on the periphery. And I think the thinking is really crucial. This does not have to be academic thinking. It does not have to be through PhDs and MPhils, although those can be very powerful as tools for us. Some of the very best thinkers actually have their thinking through practice, and can articulate that and make the case through the experience of practice as well. And I think we really do need to respect that knowledge and that learning that comes from practice as well as from research. And we certainly can't outsource our thinking to universities. It has to come from within our profession and within us as practitioners. And my experience has been that many funders, and in fact some, and maybe more and more politicians too, want to hear about this work and need this work and are prepared to fund this work as well. In some ways, the sector leadership is behind the thinking of many of the funders and many of the others who are the ones who decide our futures. And again, as a director of one institution, I need to hear the sector leaders within Wales and also within England and Scotland and Northern Ireland, the sector leaders actively advocating wholeheartedly the social justice model, not continuing to offer a kind of Janus head where they're one model of a museum in one direction, and then when it comes to certain funders and certain purposes, suddenly become very, very supportive of the social model. We need advocates at the very top of the sector, at our sector organisations, who confidently and boldly say that social justice is our purpose. The righting of inequalities is our purpose. And frankly, at the moment, I don't really hear it enough. And is this position political? Well, life is political, museums are political, everything is political. And in that sense, this manifesto is political. But I would also say the really critical factor is this manifesto is ethical. It's what we should do in the face of an unjust society, a broken society. There is no alternative ethically but to do what this manifesto should says we should do. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much. And a good reminder there of our ethical responsibility. And the first point in the Code of Ethics is about our ethical responsibility to our communities and to public benefit, but we certainly could do more to expand on that. So over to you, Dhikshana, for your final thoughts.
Thank you very much, Sharon and David. So I guess I wanted to touch upon, and I had a great conversation in the group I was in as well, but touch upon what we can do practically right now in the situation that we're in. What happens next is up to us and the work that we do around learning and engagement. We're all in institutions having no doubt very similar questions around how we continue to do our work in a new way and make sure that we're there for our staff and communities. But at the moment, what that comes with is a lot of advocacy. That's advocacy that we're really good at with our communities, but there's advocacy that needs to be done to our directors and to our boards of trustees. I started my role as head of engagement and skills in January of this year. And I won't lie, as my first role as a head of department, I would have very much liked to have enjoyed some planning, getting to know my team, my peers, to have spent some time in the beautiful Somerset House around its programming and space. But coronavirus had other ideas for me. I furloughed with the majority of my team for the first few months. And if I'm totally honest, I felt lost at how I could lead a team, and my first time being a head of a department, advocate for learning and engagement, and make sure that we were not forgotten. Even back then, there was worry in my head around what if this goes on for a while? What happens to the work that we do? What happens to my staff and to me? Working on the development of this manifesto has enabled me, and it enabled me at the time, to keep central when I discuss what the team could do, the impact that they could have, and the support and the presence we could give to our audiences and our communities, as well as our artists on site. And when I advocated to my leaders, it gave me a sense of having something as a checklist, a guide to support me through that. I returned to work when Black Lives Matters 2020 happened to work on our anti-racism pledge. I was able to connect the work of that pledge that was across our organisation directly to the work of my team. I also know that I used the manifesto in developing that pledge with my peers as well. And I was able to create an opportunity to work with young people and Kamuzi, a Black-led design consultancy, to explore the history of our building. This is just one idea. It is a small idea, but it shows how the manifesto, the passion that I had and the advocacy that I could do to my senior leaders, enabled to have a project signed off very quickly, and that we're about to start shortly. I know that when me and the team continue to work, we will do that alongside our peers across Somerset House. We will aim to be anti-racist in everything that we do, support young people and the creatives in our community. But also having a manifesto as a sense check that is backed by the Museums Association, GEM, Engage and Art Fund gives me weight when I am trying to advocate for why we do the work that we do. At the end of, as we come to the end of furlough and restrictions once again tighten, and with the announcements of this week, worry is again mounting for our staff and for all of us. And there needs to be a collaboration, a need to think about how we move forward within our organisations and that advocacy that comes with that, and not look back to the past of 2019 or previously, but to look to the future. The word accelerate has come up a lot today, and I do think that some people have been able to accelerate their work. David also mentioned that. Some have not, but I think that structures are not as firm as they used to be, and in a way that actually helps us to get things and to prove why they need to happen right now. I once thought becoming a manager or a team leader in a learning and engagement team was as far as I could go. To become a head of department in learning and engagement means everything to me, and I know I sit in a very privileged position to have that role. But in pausing projects, in planning furlough and making very difficult decisions, I also know that this year has shaped me to be a better leader and to even challenge myself in my thoughts that I've had previously. The positive learning of this year has enabled me to know that I can be more creative, I can be more responsive, and I can definitely convince leaders of the importance of learning and engagement. A real sense of hope came recently when I saw the appointment of Sarah Wajid and Zach Menzer as joint CEOs of Birmingham Museums Trust. It's groundbreaking. Sarah has worked in engagement and exhibitions. It gives all of us hope that within our roles and what we do, that we can reach the top. But it also shows us that we can be very creative in what leadership looks like and in what our structures look like going forward. As a person of colour, it gave me even more hope. The creativity and different ways of looking at things is key in this manifesto. It helps to guide us, but each of you can look at it individually to yourselves personally and to your organisations in relation to your team and what you want to achieve, using it as a way to bring your team together to think about the future. But also the key is always going to come back to advocating, to take your whole organisation on a journey to see the importance of learning and engagement, how it's in everyone's job. It's not just, does not just sit within one department. It is also, I hope, gives you a sense of, like me, a place to sense check what you're thinking, where you're going, what you're doing, and advocate for your career and where you want to go. I hope that in the coming months, you are kind to yourselves, because there are some very difficult decisions that I know that you'll be making. And I hope that this manifesto can give you somewhere to go and find a way to answer some of those difficult questions. It's called a Learning and Engagement Manifesto, but let's be honest, it's actually a manifesto for our whole sector. I wish you luck, and if you find that crystal ball, please let me know, because I'm really looking for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dhikshana. That was an amazing way to end an amazing morning. I think there's a lot of interesting ideas and feedback in the chat function, which we will capture and we're happy to share with you. We will put the video online. It's been a brilliant morning exploring the ideas behind the manifesto, but also thinking about how we might implement it. We're really listening to what you say. There's points in the manifesto about building trust within organisations and across organisations, with trustees and with other colleagues, and that's exactly what we need to do. I'll end on this point. We live in challenging times, but museums are stepping up to the plate and working with their communities, I hope, to create a better future, and everyone in this room is part of that. Thank you very much for taking part.